Charles-André Joseph Marie de Gaulle stands as one of the most towering figures in French and world history, a man whose life spanned nearly 8 decades of profound political, social, and military transformation. Born on November 22, 1890, in Lille, France, de Gaulle would become the architect of modern France, leading his nation through its darkest hour and reshaping its destiny in the post-war world. Charles de Gaulle was born into a devoutly Catholic, conservative family that embodied traditional French values. His father, Henri de Gaulle, was a professor of philosophy and literature at a Jesuit college, while his mother, Jeanne Maillot Delanoy, came from a family of industrialists from Lille. The de Gaulle household fostered intellectual discourse, exposing young Charles to literature, history, and philosophy from an early age. Growing up in a family that revered French history, de Gaulle developed an early fascination with military affairs and French grandeur. He was particularly influenced by his father, stories of French military heroes, and his uncle's accounts of the Franco-Prussian War. This early exposure to France's military defeats would profoundly shape his worldview and his later determination to restore French greatness. De Gaulle excelled in history and literature at the Collège Stanislas in Paris, demonstrating exceptional memory and analytical insight that would characterize his later career. In 1909, de Gaulle entered the prestigious Saint-Cyr Military Academy, graduating in 1912, ranked 13th in his class. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to the 33rd Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Philippe Pétain, who would later become both his mentor and political opponent. World War I thrust the young officer into modern warfare's crucible. De Gaulle was wounded 3 times, finally captured at Verdun in 1916, while rallying his men. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, making 5 unsuccessful escape attempts and using his captivity to study German military doctrine. After the war, de Gaulle attended the École Supérieure de Guerre, developing controversial theories about modern warfare, particularly the importance of professional armies and armored divisions. His ideas clashed with prevailing French defensive doctrine. In 1934, he published Vers l'armée de métier, the Army of the Future, advocating for mechanized armies capable of rapid offensive operations. These prescient warnings were largely ignored by French leadership, but studied by German strategists who implemented similar concepts in blitzkrieg tactics. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, de Gaulle was a brigadier general commanding the 4th Armored Division. Despite the overall French collapse, his division achieved some notable successes against German forces, providing one of the few bright spots in an otherwise disastrous campaign. However, these tactical victories could not stem the tide of defeat. As France crumbled and Marshal Pétain negotiated an armistice with Germany, de Gaulle made a decision that would define his place in history. On June 17, 1940, he flew to London, where he prepared to make his historic appeal to the French people. On June 18, 1940, speaking from BBC Radio, de Gaulle delivered what would become known as the Appel du 18 Juin, Appeal of June 18th, declaring, "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." This broadcast marked the birth of the French resistance and established de Gaulle as the leader of Free France. Initially, few heard the actual broadcast, and fewer still rallied to his cause. The French government declared him a traitor and sentenced him to death in absentia. However, his message gradually spread, and slowly, French colonies and resistance groups began to recognize his leadership. Leading Free France from London proved enormously challenging. De Gaulle had to establish legitimacy internationally and among the French people, coordinate resistance activities, and navigate complex relationships with Allied powers. His relationship with Britain was often stormy, and Roosevelt was reluctant to recognize his authority. Despite diplomatic challenges, de Gaulle gradually built Free France into a significant force. French colonies in Africa began rallying to his cause, and Free French forces participated in campaigns across North Africa, Italy, and eventually France's liberation. De Gaulle's greatest achievement was maintaining French unity and independence within the Allied coalition, refusing to allow France to be treated as a client state. The liberation of Paris in August 1944 marked his triumphant return. with his march down the Champs-Élysées symbolizing restored French independence. Following liberation, de Gaulle headed the provisional government of the French Republic, facing the enormous task of rebuilding a nation devastated by war and occupation. His administration had to restore order, rebuild infrastructure, purge collaborators, and establish new democratic institutions. De Gaulle's provisional government implemented significant reforms, including extending voting rights to women, nationalizing key industries, and establishing comprehensive social security systems. However, his vision for France's future increasingly clashed with that of the traditional political parties that re-emerged after the war. De Gaulle favored a strong presidential system that could provide stable governance and enable France to play a major role in world affairs. The political parties, scarred by memories of authoritarian rule, preferred a parliamentary system with a weak executive. When it became clear that the new constitution would establish what de Gaulle considered an ineffective parliamentary system, he resigned as head of government in January 1946. His departure speech was characteristically blunt. "The exclusive regime of parties has returned. I disapprove of it. But short of establishing by force a dictatorship which I do not want, and which would doubtless turn out badly, I have no means of preventing this experiment." De Gaulle's resignation began what he later called his traverse of the desert. 12 years out of power, during which he watched the Fourth Republic struggle with the problems he had predicted. The new regime was indeed characterized by governmental instability, with cabinets lasting an average of only 6 months. During this period, de Gaulle established the Rally of the French People, RPF, in 1947, a political movement designed to transcend traditional party politics and advocate for constitutional reform. The RPF achieved considerable success in local elections, but failed to gain power at the national level. De Gaulle's movement was caught between his refusal to participate in the system of the Fourth Republic and his inability to change it from outside. The Fourth Republic did achieve some notable successes, including economic recovery, the beginnings of European integration, and decolonization in Indochina, though this ended in defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. However, it struggled with colonial conflicts, particularly in Algeria, which began in 1954 and gradually escalated into a full-scale war. During these wilderness years, de Gaulle wrote his war memoirs, which became both a literary masterpiece and a political document asserting his vision of France's role in the world. He also maintained his political network and waited for the moment when France would once again need his leadership. That moment came in May 1958, when the Algerian crisis brought down the Fourth Republic. The French army in Algeria, supported by French settlers, rebelled against the government in Paris, threatening civil war. The political system proved incapable of resolving the crisis, and on May 29th, President René Coty called upon de Gaulle to form a government. De Gaulle accepted power on his terms, a new constitution that would establish a strong presidency and give him the authority to resolve the Algerian question. The French people overwhelmingly approved the new constitution in September 1958, and de Gaulle was elected as the first president of the Fifth Republic in December. The Algerian War presented de Gaulle with one of his greatest challenges. Many who had supported his return to power, particularly in the army and among the settlers, expected him to maintain French Algeria. However, de Gaulle gradually came to the conclusion that Algeria must become independent. This decision, while strategically sound, led to fierce opposition from the French right and several attempts on his life by the OAS, secret armed organization. De Gaulle's handling of the Algerian crisis demonstrated his political courage and strategic vision. Despite enormous pressure and personal danger, he pursued negotiations with the Algerian independence movement, leading to the Evian Accords in 1962 and Algerian independence. This decision, while painful for many French citizens, allowed France to turn its attention to modernization and European leadership. As president of the Fifth Republic, de Gaulle transformed France both domestically and internationally. His domestic policies focused on modernizing the French economy, strengthening state institutions, and promoting technological advancement. The glorious 30 years of French economic growth coincided with his presidency, as France experienced unprecedented prosperity and modernization. De Gaulle's foreign policy was based on his concept of certain idea of France, the belief that France must maintain its independence and grandeur in world affairs. This led to several controversial decisions that often put France at odds with its allies. In 1960, France successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, making it the world's fourth nuclear power. De Gaulle saw nuclear weapons as essential to French independence and credibility as a major power. He pursued a policy of détente with the Soviet Union and Communist China, believing that the Cold War division of Europe was artificial and temporary. His vision of Europe, from the Atlantic to the Urals, challenged the bipolar world order. De Gaulle withdrew France from NATO's integrated command structure in 1966, while remaining in the Atlantic Alliance. This decision reflected his belief that France must maintain strategic autonomy and not become a mere client of the United States. He opposed British membership in the European Economic Community, vetoing British applications in 1963 and 1967. De Gaulle feared that British membership would make Europe subordinate to American interests. Domestically, de Gaulle's presidency was marked by rapid economic growth, urban development, and cultural flourishing. However, his authoritarian style and the rigidity of French society created tensions that exploded in May 1968, when student protests and worker strikes nearly brought down his government. Though he survived the crisis, it marked the beginning of his decline. In April 1969, de Gaulle staked his presidency on a referendum on constitutional reform and regionalization. When the referendum was defeated, he immediately resigned, stating simply, "I cease to exercise my functions as President of the Republic. This decision takes effect today at noon." De Gaulle retired to his country home in Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, where he worked on his memoirs and reflected on his long career. On November 9, 1970, while playing solitaire at his dining room table, he collapsed and died of a heart attack. His last words, reportedly, were, "It hurts." True to his character, de Gaulle had requested a simple funeral in his village, refusing a state funeral in Paris. However, world leaders gathered at Notre Dame for a memorial service, paying tribute to one of the towering figures of the 20th century. Charles de Gaulle's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He was simultaneously a democrat and an authoritarian, a traditionalist and a modernizer, a European and a nationalist. His greatest achievement was preserving French independence and dignity during the nation's darkest hour, and then transforming France into a modern, prosperous nation capable of playing a major role in world affairs. De Gaulle's concept of leadership was based on his belief that great leaders must embody the permanent interests of their nation, sometimes against the temporary wishes of the people. This philosophy enabled him to make difficult but necessary decisions, from the call to resistance in 1940 to Algerian independence in 1962. His institutional legacy, the Fifth Republic, has proven remarkably durable, providing France with stable government for more than 6 decades. The strong presidency he created has enabled France to play a leadership role in European integration and global affairs. Critics argue that de Gaulle's authoritarianism and nationalism hindered democratic development and European integration. His opposition to supranational institutions and his emphasis on national sovereignty created tensions that persist in French politics today. However, most historians acknowledge that de Gaulle was an exceptional leader who appeared at crucial moments in French history when ordinary politicians had failed. His combination of strategic vision, political courage, and rhetorical brilliance enabled him to reshape France's destiny and secure its place among the world's leading nations. Charles de Gaulle died as he had lived, on his own terms, having given France what he considered his duty, a certain idea of grandeur, independence, and dignity that continues to influence French politics and foreign policy today. Whether admired or criticized, he remains an inescapable figure in understanding modern France and the turbulent history of the 20th century. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.